training program is skill acquisition of a handstand. But before we look at the training program itself, let's have a look into the background analysis of a handstand and the technique involved in doing one. The handstand is a less stable inverted stance where the individual aims to maintain vertical orientation while balancing on their hands. When compared to a regular bipedal stance on one's feet, a handstand is made inherently more difficult due to the smaller base of support, the higher center of gravity, and the decreased ability of the wrist to produce torques. To be able to perform and balance an aesthetic straight line handstand, I chose to use a single segment wrist strategy. This was chosen as it is the most widely used control strategy and has been shown in research to be employed in the majority of the time and is successful in achieving that aesthetic form. This strategy revolves around single segment control of the wrist torque, the most inferior joint in a handstand, as well as maintaining a fixed orientation of all the superior joints. Other strategies that can also achieve a handstand include manipulation of the elbow, shoulder, and hip joints to maintain stability, as well as multi-joint strategies. These strategies have also proven to be successful and are seen in sports such as dance and other freestyle activities, but they will not be learnt in this project, so we will be focusing on the single segment inverted pendulum control strategy. When we begin to break down the handstand technique, it becomes very complex, as many factors of the complex system must be manipulated in order to reach an attractor state and be able to balance in an inverted position. Beginning at the most important and inferior joint, the wrist. Wrist and fingers must be flexed. The weight must be supported in the fingers to control posterior sway and cannot be in the palms, as anterior sway is not easily counterbalanced without the form of other joints suffering. Vision also plays a large role in the handstand due to the proximity of the eyes to the floor. Optimal position has the head in slight cervical extension, with the gaze aimed 5 cm anterior to the space between the hands. Shoulders should be elevated and abducted to increase stability and straighten out the upper back. To straighten the lower back, gluteal muscles are contracted to extend and slightly externally rotate the hips. Additional to this, the rectus abdominis and other core muscles are activated to achieve posterior pelvic tilt. Finally, knee extension and foot plantar flexion straighten out the legs to achieve straight legs, while the hip adductors hold the legs together. These technical concepts just discussed present many constraints to be overcome going into the training program. Minimal environmental constraints play into this exercise as it is performed in a controlled situation with only the ground surface affecting the complex system. Many organismic constraints will come into play due to the difficulty of this movement, and these include the person's balance, strength, both in the upper body to support the weight, and core and lower ability to maintain form, muscular endurance to aid in balance and hold the handstand for a long period of time, and flexibility of all the muscles and joints involved to achieve that aesthetic upright position. Another organismic constraint is the declarative knowledge of the person. This knowledge is seen to improve a gymnast's ability to self-correct and also assisted them in developing automated motor control processes to help them control their handstand. The task constraints are the most predominant in a handstand and created the most difficulty in my skill acquisition of a handstand. The limited equipment and lack of a coach or spotter slow down the process of acquisition and the speed in which attractor states are found, due to the inability to perform certain exercises and the lack of verbal cues from a coach. Other constraints the task presented included balancing on a smaller base of support with increased distance between the body's center of gravity and support surface, which created a greater amount of anterior-posterior deviations. In addition to this, there is the decreased ability of the wrist to produce torques and the use of the single segment inverted pendulum control strategy. The constraints-led approach was applied in a 3-stage process throughout the training program, based off Valentin Usanov's 4-stage training model to achieve a handstand. To address the aforementioned constraints, the first stage will focus on developing the physical ability to assume the inverted straight line body position, as well as to gain and control the power required to enter the handstand position. This stage will include conditioning of the support and wrist strength, body shape, shoulder girdle, pelvic rotation, and flexibility work. The second stage, while continuing to maintain strength and work on any deficits, will focus on consistent practice, balance, and more advanced compound exercises that will assist in learning a handstand. This included using sessions to work on individual sections of the handstand technique and to minimize the degrees of freedom. In addition to this stage will also focus on learning to self-correct each element of technique using video analysis recorded during training sessions. The final stage of the project will continue to focus on balance, and in addition to this, balance without objects or support used. Before beginning the training program, I performed a pre-test that involved an objective test of how long a wall handstand could be held and a subjective test of how straight a handstand could be held using video recording to judge the performance. These tests are performed again after 20 hours of training to conclude the project, as well as the subjective video test being performed every 5 hours to track performance outcome. After performing the initial pre-test, I used videos from professional athletes who could perform handstands, such as gymnasts, yoga instructors, and dancers. These videos allowed me to observe how a professional enters into and sustains a handstand, as well as additional exercises to help build strength and flexibility. From these, I was able to apply the theoretical knowledge I had gained to a visual stimulus, aiding me in using visual imagery during my handstand practice. Stage 1 involves 3 to 4 30-minute to 1 hour sport-specific strength workouts per week, and flexibility involved in the warm-ups. Strength exercises performed address the 5 key areas of conditioning that were required. Practice sessions began with a warm-up, which firstly started with wrist stretches, doing 10 movements in each direction to make sure the wrists are warm and to increase wrist strength. This is then followed by a downward dog stretch and a single leg downward dog stretch to stretch out the hamstrings and to activate the glutes, core and shoulder muscles. The last exercise included in the warm-up was a hollow body rock. This was done to activate the core muscles with regressions to a single bent leg hollow body rock and a double bent leg hollow body rock. These are some of the exercises that would have been included in a stage 1 workout. General workouts included 5 to 10 exercises, which were completed in 3 sets of 10. The first exercise is a wrist curl to increase the strength of the base of support. Headstands were performed to aid in the conditioning of the body shape, as well as to practice balance in the inverted position. For shoulder girdle strength, push plus push-ups were performed to increase the strength of serratus anterior, pectoralis minor, rhomboids trapezius, and levator scapulae. For core conditioning and posterior pelvic tilt, static shape holds were done in both the prone and supine position. In addition to this, a prone posterior pelvic tilt was also held. These positions were generally held for 30 seconds at a time. To practice entry into the handstand and balance in the handstand position, lunge entry position into a wall handstand was done. Downward dog weight transfers onto the wrist were also performed to increase the wrist strength and to get used to the feeling of transferring the weight into the fingertips of the hands. From this, it was progressed to a single leg kick up and then into a single leg kick up into a wall handstand. Exercises performed to increase the leg power and to prepare and to learn how to kick up into a handstand included single leg kickoffs, lunge leg extensions, a tick-tock kick up to increase the amount of time spent on the hands in the inverted position, and finally, to practice balance in stage 1, a bent leg wall handstand was used to assist in getting the body into the straight vertical position. To then progress to stage 2, the assessment was to be able to hold a handstand for 30 seconds. This measure is used among professional gymnasts to assess strength of novices before they are allowed to progress onto more complex apparatuses and movements. For this assessment, I used a wall to aid in balance as I had not yet developed the balance needed to hold a handstand without support, and I achieved this after 6 hours of training. In the 7th hour, I progressed on to stage 2. Stage 2 began with the same warm-up and workouts became more consistent 6 to 7 times a week, but decreased in length to 20 to 30 minutes due to the increased wrist fatigue as the majority of the time was spent in the inverted position. We would begin with 2 or 3 strength or balance exercises to address the deficits that were highlighted in previous training sessions, and spend the remainder of the allocated time focusing on one particular area of technique. During stage 2, after spending time overcoming the organismic constraints, the majority of the time was spent focusing on the task constraints, with each section focusing on one element of the handstand technique. This was done in a wall handstand and was done with the purpose of decreasing the degrees of freedom to allow the individual to find an attractive state in each position. The 8 areas of technique that were focused on throughout these sessions included plantar flexion of the feet, knee extension, posterior pelvic tilt to flatten out the lower back, hip extension with a slight external rotation to assist in the kick up as well as flattening out the lower back, shoulder girdle adduction to round out the upper back, shoulder girdle elevation which aided in balance, slight cervical extension so the gaze could rest on that point 5 centimeters in front of the gap between the hands, and finally wrist and finger flexion with the focus of transferring the weight into the fingers instead of the palm of the hands. This last point was a major factor as it was an imperative part of the wrist balance strategy. More complex exercises were added with a focus on moving to balance rather than on strength. The exercises that included donkey kicks into a wall handstand, which required much more core strength and glute control, as well as proper preparation with the weight starting at the fingertips. A scale balance exercise was also done. This required additional balance as well as shoulder, core and glute activation. This exercise progressed into a scale balance with a kick up into a wall handstand. A yoga position, the crow pose, was also included in this stage of the workouts to aid in balance as well as to strengthen the base of support. Regressions in this exercise included a modified crow pose and a single leg crow pose. The plank to pike wall walk was also included. This focused on increasing core strength as well as balance and strengthening the base of support. The final exercise that was added on in this stage was a pike press to headstand, which worked on conditioning muscular control, balance and endurance. As alluded to in research, progressions in stage 2 came along a lot slower. Balance was slowly developed throughout the hours, and at the 15-hour mark, I started to progress into stage 3. This included doing handstands without the support of a wall. To progress into being able to do this, a handstand was performed with a wall not too far away. This was done to decrease the risk of injury to the back and shoulders if one was to fall forwards out of the handstand. Results obtained from this training program showed great improvements in technique and ability. At the end of the 20-hour program, an aesthetic straight-line body position was achieved, with large advances seen in control and balance. Objective test measure recordings were 6 seconds holding a wall handstand at 0 hours, with great difficulty seen in obtaining that initial position. At 6 hours, a time of 30 seconds was recorded, and in the final objective test, the wall handstand was held for 1:20. Subjective tests showed substantial changes with increases in how aesthetic and straight the inverted body position was, as well as during the kick-up phase. The initial tests saw no technique used in the kick-up, dorsiflex feet, flex knees, and no pelvic tilt or shoulder elevation, creating an arched handstand, decreasing the ability to balance. Considerable advancements were seen in the second performance outcome analysis completed at 5 hours, following some training and research into the handstand technique. Preparation went into the handstand, but knees were still flexed in the kick-up, lacking strength and control. Some difficulty was seen getting into the wall handstand, but knee extension and foot plantar flexion were improved, as well as some correction in the posterior pelvic tilt. The 10-hour test results showed increased hamstring flexibility and control, improving the kick-up. In the handstand, leg adduction, knee extension, and foot plantar flexion were enhanced. Additionally, corrections in pelvic tilt and shoulder elevation, as well as finger flexion and weight transfer were seen. In the 15-hour test, some regressions were seen in stability and control of the kick-up, with knees becoming flexed. The handstand showed great improvements in sustained control and balance, further improved finger flexion and posterior pelvic tilt. The final test showed the most aesthetic straight bodyline position. Regressions in the kick-up were improved. In the handstand, finger flexion was consistently used to aid in balance. Shoulders were elevated, and even further improvements were seen in the posterior pelvic tilt. The results of this project were aligned with that of the research outlined in the background analysis. Use of specific strength exercises resulted in substantial improvements in the first 10 hours, including stage 1 and the start of stage 2, with gradual improvements in the latter half. The wrist balance strategy proved effective in controlling balance, shown in the developments through the subjective tests. Video feedback was also useful in correcting motor imagery and technique in each session, and I benefited from this, though it also highlighted the limitation of not having a coach to give verbal cues and act of a spotter. The result of having this would have meant faster improvements, taking away the need to analyze footage, and being able to do on-the-spot corrections. This, combined with the lack of gymnastics equipment, had the consequence of not being able to do a lot of development on the wrist strategy, which created balance deficits. Another limitation was a wrist injury that occurred 15 hours into the program, and decreased training load dramatically. Following the return to training after this, regressions were seen in balance, supporting research that states the importance of consistent handstand practice to attain the technique and balance advances. Through the use of the constraints-led approach, specific organismic constraints were overcome, shown through gained control in both the kick-up and handstand. Task constraints were also improved upon with great technical improvements gained from training with decreased degrees of freedom. Overall, results proved a successful training program with the aim of achieving an aesthetic straight-line body position in a handstand being attained, as seen in the final subjective test. The constraints-led approach was extremely successful in the initial phase of the program, efficiently overcoming constraints to kicking up into a handstand and holding that position. In future training, continued development of the balance will be beneficial with a greater focus on developing the wrist balance strategy with the aid of one-on-one coaching and verbal cues.